So I very much appreciate it. I just thought we'd jump into it because, like we said, it's quite early in both of our locations. So I don't want to keep you too long. I know you've probably got a busy day ahead. As you know, as always, it's good to be busy, to be honest. We've got a couple of areas to cover for today's interview. I would love to learn a little bit more about you, and obviously the main reason we're here being Fly Atlantic. I think the perfect place to begin, though, is with you, and I think one of the first things you're able to notice about your career is the wealth of experience you've had in the aviation industry across many different companies, many different roles as well. Can you tell me a little bit about those previous experiences you've had, how maybe they came about, and what you've taken with you into your position today now with Fly Atlantic?
Yeah. Look, I started in the full service airline sector, and airline was pretty much in my blood because my father was a cockpit crew in the distant past for BEA, which was the predecessor to British Airways. So, I grew up going to airports, looking at aeroplanes. That background was always there. So aviation was always a passion. And actually, I wanted to be a helicopter pilot with the army in Britain, and then failed my eyesight test on color blindness, so I couldn't do that. So frustrated in that area, I joined the airline industry and went for civil aviation. So I started at British Airways doing every job imaginable. Actually, a lot of airport jobs, a lot of commercial jobs. Then had a kind of sabbatical from aviation for 13 years when I started working in Hong Kong. But I came back to aviation again through the full service airline route by working for Cathay Pacific for 7 years. And then about 2004, I was a little bit frustrated at basically having worked in the same niche area at Cathay for a long period of time. So I decided to have a look at setting up my own airline, and that was Viva Macau. It sounds daft actually, but I bought a book in an airport bookshop on a stopover, which was called How to Start an Airline or something like that. And just reading it on the plane, I thought, that doesn't sound so difficult. It sounds a ridiculous story, but it was pretty much like that.
Please go away.
Hey, what about my world?
I don't think anyone cares. You also look like a creepy character from a game in aisle 7 of Target.
That is not true. Hero Wars has vibrant graphics, cool gameplay, and a user-friendly interface.
Well, let's see. I guess I'm open to new things.
Yeah, tell them more about it.
With Hero Wars, you have the ability to find a character that suits yourself. Maybe it's not what we saw before, but there's aliens, vampires, and much more. It's also a lengthy process to unlock them all. Jabba, or if you ask me, Jabba the Hutt, is great for tanking and maybe comparable to a beluga. Celesta is an S tier, useful in any situation thanks to the ability to switch between a healer and DPS dark form. It's very easy to start assembling the perfect team. You can play wherever you want, even if you're sat at an airport with a 10+ hour layover. And plus, from December 24th, the Christmas magic arrives to Hero Wars, with presents, mysterious stories, a Christmas tree, and an advent calendar. With 6 unique worlds, 300 Guild War servers, and 100 million players, there's actually more people on this platform than those that pass through London Heathrow on a yearly basis. Oh, I almost forgot. Where can you get 30,000 coins, 600 emeralds, and 5 awesome heroes to start dominating in HW right away? Too slow. The answer is in the link that can be found in the description and the pinned comment. Play Hero Wars today. Thanks to Hero Wars for being generous enough to sponsor the video and support future DJ's aviation projects. Make sure to download the game.
The Viva Macau story, was very complex, but we basically got the airline into position and started operating, which in itself was an achievement because Macau was a monopoly environment for airlines at that time. So there was a lot of politics about it. And that was the first in a series of startups that I got involved with. I was also involved with setting up the first low-cost airline in Russia called Avianova. And then a couple of, an airline in Cyprus called Cobalt. I also worked at the low-cost airlines, Vietjet in Vietnam and WOW Air in Iceland. And it was really the time at WOW Air in Iceland that gave me the inspiration for Fly Atlantic, because WOW Air was operating a very similar model to the one we intend to model. So we intend to operate. So yeah, I mean, I think it runs into 13 airlines over 11 countries. So it's a pretty rich tapestry of experience. You asked what I bring from all that experience to Fly Atlantic. I mean, I'm certainly used to starting airlines, developing business plans, raising capital for airlines. I think the WOW experience, though, in Iceland is directly relevant to what I'm doing at Fly Atlantic.
That's I find it very interesting. At the beginning, you did mention that you sort of started off doing a host of different roles at the airport, and having spoken to other people within the industry, actually a lot of people start in that area as well, whether it's handling the baggage, doing face-to-face, and it gives them that opportunity to try out a host of different roles before really finding what they enjoy or what they're good at, whether they take a break or whether they dive into upper management many years down the line. So I find that very interesting. And you mentioned just at the end there, Fly Atlantic, and that's one of the main reasons we're here today for a bit of a discussion. And this is the airline that you're the Chief Executive Officer of. And for people that do not know, you're hoping to operate low-cost transatlantic flights from 2024, and you'll be based out of Belfast, linking Europe to North America. So you did mention WOW Air previously, and you said how that really spurred it on. Is there any more you can sort of dive into about how this airline came to fruition?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I was working on a project in Cyprus called TUS Airways, and working on a restructuring of that airline, a transition actually from operating pretty old Fokker aircraft to bringing in A320s when COVID struck. You know, pretty much as we were right at the most critical point of that transition, changing equipment and changing the business plan. So COVID in Cyprus, well, COVID itself in Cyprus, maybe the impact was not so huge, but the ramifications of the lockdowns in Cyprus were very serious for the airline industry. The island was sort of closed down for a period of time. So in that situation, I mean, we couldn't do much more work on the TUS Airways project. And I relocated to the UK in 2020 to look at other opportunities. And it was at that point that the concept came back into my head of looking at an airline that built on the strengths of the WOW Air model, but also addressed some of the weaknesses of the WOW Air model. In other words, taking the best out of that experience, but tweaking it, because WOW itself had gone down, I think, in 2019 or 2018. And so clearly that model wasn't sustainable as it was being executed, but it had a lot of potential, I thought, for long-term profitability and for being a successful type of airline. So the idea really came, the gestation period was from, I guess, mid-2020 onwards, took shape over the rest of 2020, over 2021, looking at, we developed a business plan and then had to look at which airport would be a suitable base and a suitable hub for the operation. Because key to this was the idea that, one of the reasons that WOW had failed was the problem of being based in a very expensive economy, operating out of a very expensive airport. And so, the obvious thing to fix in the beginning was to find an airport that delivered the operational capabilities we require, but also offered the pricing and the economic structure that we required to make a success of the airline. So a lot of work initially went into negotiations with airports and choosing a suitable base and a suitable hub. And that was ran on through 2021, most of 2021.
So you'd say it's very much for example, we've talked a lot about WOW Air. You'd say it very much comes down to nitpicking that as a business, taking a look at what went right and also what went wrong. And I'm sure there are other airlines you also studied. And again, you've had that wealth of experience where you've done a lot of this before. So you're able to look at, hey, I probably would want to do this a little bit differently. You did mention, of course, the airport and the geographical location as being hugely important. And aside from what you mentioned, I think probably the biggest thing when someone looks at a new airline is where it's going to be based out of. And as we know, that's going to be Belfast International. So, bar what you said, are there any other advantages to picking this airport as a home location?
I think another issue around WOW, and I don't want to keep referencing WOW. It was a very good airline, had a lot of great people in it. It was sad that it went down, but I think what Belfast has, what Northern Ireland has, is a much bigger catchment population. Iceland is 350,000 people. We're here in Northern Ireland with 1.8 million. So it's a much bigger home population, but also, of course, we're sitting in a position where we can service two very important markets. One is the North America Ireland market, and the other is the North America and UK market. And these are two of the biggest markets across the North Atlantic. And Belfast is uniquely placed to serve as a gateway both to the island of Ireland and also to the rest of the UK. So it's from that point of view, the market size was also a big factor. Geographical positioning, of course, because that's critical to getting the operation right and being able to operate transatlantically and a long way into the US and into Canada using the new generation of narrow-bodied aircraft. So these were factors, and I think another element here was that we expected to get, and we did receive good political support locally from all the political parties in Northern Ireland. So the political context was good as well. And so one final point, which actually is perhaps also very critical, is that whereas in the UK mainland, if you fly from Britain, you're paying over £80 in departure tax for long haul flights. Out of Northern Ireland, there is no departure tax on long haul flights. So immediately you've built in a pretty important advantage vis-a-vis passengers who are using Belfast rather than flying from, say, Manchester or Glasgow or London.
I find it interesting that you mention the catchment and the population. Funnily enough, when I was preparing for this interview, being Australian myself, populations in every single area probably isn't at the top of my forte. So I was just very curious and did actually look up the population of Northern Ireland. But then I did also look up, how you said, the population of other areas where we've seen these similar business models. And it was interesting to see, like you said, just the large difference. You're moving from a couple 100,000 to, well, into the millions, which I'm sure makes a huge difference in regarding demand, and it leaves you probably filled with a little bit more confidence than, say, approaching a market that may only have 100,000 or 200,000 with such a big idea. One of the, I think this is probably leading on more the fun questions. Obviously, when we see a new airline, there's multiple different areas that are critically important, but I think maybe one that flies under the radar and maybe picked up more by the enthusiasts is the branding and the livery that's featured. And there's been a lot of questions about the Fly Atlantic concept livery, if it is, that has been featured on the aircraft. Did you want to dive into maybe the meaning behind it or how it came about?
I wouldn't read too much into it. I mean, people read a lot into liveries and names, and in my experience in the airline industry, what owners of airlines in particular focus on, oddly enough, would be liveries, names, branding, and cabin crew uniforms. These are sort of big issues for them, where they get very emotional and very committed, and it sparks big arguments at the board level. The Fly Atlantic livery, I mean, I like it very much. Somebody recently did a production where they put all the liveries of the various airlines I've been associated with together on one sheet, and I do take livery and branding seriously, obviously, because it is at the core of customer appeal. But I mean, you probably need to talk to the designers rather than me about the meaning behind it. I think there are the two issues. First of all, you could interpret the livery as a New York skyline. And so the transatlantic element is certainly there. And then you can also interpret it as a series of digital codes. So it's indicative of a cutting edge new type of airline. I mean, I don't want to be prescriptive about how you should interpret it. I think it's down to the individual, actually. But I know we'll have a lot of fun rolling out the brand, and we may fine tune and tweak that brand. I hope and I think the name will stay intact. I think it's simple, it's direct. Airline is what's written on the tin, and we'll have a lot of fun with all those design elements. That is that is one of the more exciting elements of starting a new airline. There are many, but that's central to it. Yeah.
I'm sure it can also be one of the most difficult and challenging tasks as well, securing something that you're happy with and everyone's happy with, and not changing 5 minutes later and thinking, oh, maybe this idea is better than this one.
Well, right the way through all the startups I've been involved with, I think you have to recognize that you can't do these things by committee. You hear a name and it sticks and it works. In Macau, ironically, my first startup, we originally called that airline Wow Macau. Ironic in the light of me later working in Iceland for Wow Air. And we couldn't use Wow Macau because Lufthansa had a cargo program that had the name Wow in it. So they sent a letter, and we dropped that name. And we brainstormed, around the table whilst drinking a few pints of beer. We brainstormed on what to call the airline, and suggestion number 428 was Viva Macau, and it worked very well. And the minute you hear the name, it's right and it fits. It has to require. It's not a process which you can approach too rationally or systematically. You have to rely on that spark of inspiration. But flight didn't require 428 attempts. I think it was very, very simple, very straightforward, and very easy to coin that name for the airline.
Which must be nice. And you did mention on the delivery front, you could interpret it however you want, but you could definitely potentially say the New York city skyline. And I guess that does lead me on to a question regarding your network, which of course is going to be hugely important. You've briefly mentioned some areas that you would like to target. At this point, have you taken a look at any specific cities maybe that would be of interest, whether it be on the North American side or the other?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we could put a business plan together if we hadn't looked at where we want to fly and how we want to fly. Assessing the size of fleet and the economic results from that. I may have inadvertently given away one of our destinations, but I'm sure that's not a big shock if people deduce from all this that we might fly to New York. That won't be a surprise. But I do want to be quite guarded in what we say about the rest of the network. And I think the obvious point is we don't want to flag to the competition where we're going to operate at this stage, nearly 2 years out from a launch. But the other issue here, Daniel, is that things change, as we well know from the pandemic. Situations change, circumstances change. And what we envisage today as a network almost inevitably will be modified before we get to the air. It's particularly true of the feeder network because whilst we don't let our competitors determine where we fly, it would be crazy to ignore what they're doing and to just blindly plow ahead and fly where we want to fly. So there'll definitely be a lot of modifications and evolution before we actually get into the air. In broad geographical terms, we'll be focused on the northeast quadrant of the US. We'll be focused on eastern Canada. No plans to go to the west coast, and we will be looking at, in terms of feeder network, a lot of points in the rest of the UK, but also Central Europe, Eastern Europe, right the way down to places like Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, Cyprus.
Of course. And look, to have any kind of network, fleet is hugely important, but that can also change from, as you said, different circumstances. Take a look at the pandemic, something we never thought would happen, and overnight, everything changes at a moment's notice. And for you as well, it completely threw off your plans, but also created a new opportunity in how you've said with Fly Atlantic. A couple of the reports have indicated a 737 MAX type aircraft, an A321neo. Correct me if I'm wrong there on the neo. I'm not too sure if it was the 321 just strictly or the new engine option. Talk to me about how the decisions come about in terms of aircraft? Obviously nothing firm at the moment, but how as an airline you determine a specific plane is a good candidate?
Well, coming into this project, Daniel, I talked about the flaws in the WOW business plan and what didn't go right. And part of the problem there was the mix of aircraft types. So you come into this knowing that you need a single aircraft type that could do all the missions in the business plan. And you also come into this, or I came into this exercise knowing that the route economics changed dramatically with the introduction of the new engine option on both the MAX and the 321. So that enables airlines to look at single aisle, relatively small aircraft on transatlantic operations, and that wasn't necessarily the case 5, 7, 10 years ago. That has changed the economics on the North Atlantic. So if you take the position that, right, we're going to go for narrow-bodied single aisle aircraft, then the options come down to really the MAX or the 321neo. There may be. Well, no, I think there aren't. I mean, it basically comes down to those two aircraft types and making an evaluation of which one works better for the network. We're keeping our options open. I think the plan has leaned towards the 321 up until now. There may be an option to switch to the MAX. We're evaluating that. And, part of, it's a complex process, but let's say that we're leaning in the direction of 321, but we haven't ruled out the MAX as an option. It will come down to, of course, it will come down to cost and how that flows through our business plan. Also comes down to issues like the availability of aircraft at a certain time. But they're both good aircraft. The MAX has, as you know, there's a number of variants, the 700, the 800, and the 900. So, a lot to think about, but decisions have to be made now because the lead time for getting these aircraft spec'd, as we would put it in a technical sense, the lead time for getting these aircraft ready for operation in summer 2024 is pretty much now. We've got to make decisions very quickly in that area.
I've always said with regards to fleet, there's always a lot of flexibility there. It can always be quite a complicated decision as well, but one of the main things I've always said to many people is in the aviation industry, let's say 5-year period is not actually that long in advance. Like you sort of have said right here, we've got to make decisions right now for 2024, whereas in maybe another business, you'll do it in incremental year planning. And while to a certain extent in a business for aviation, you can do year planning, there are some decisions that have to be made 5 years in advance. And for an established carrier, even longer than that, because like you said, you deal with the availability, the costs. Oh, this aircraft needs to be replaced with this one. So naturally, that's almost moving me into the next topic of the challenges when it comes to starting a new airline, and especially for Fly Atlantic, I'm sure, as you know, nothing is smooth sailing. There's always bumps in the road, maybe when you don't want it. So with regards to Fly Atlantic, it's a business model we've seen occur many times now, and there's, like you said, there's been issues with some and it's worked with others. How do you believe as an airline, Fly Atlantic will be able to sustain demand year-round? Because we have seen in some areas, there's peaks, there's low points. Do you think the larger catchment will help with that? Or a route network?
Yeah, I mean, seasonality is what you're really focused on here, Daniel. The fact that North Atlantic is a seasonal market where you have big numbers traveling in the summer and relatively smaller numbers in the winter. How do you deal with that? I mean, what you've really got to look at is taking some of the aircraft off the North Atlantic in the winter season and using them in other markets, and looking at what we would call in the business ACMI operations. So you put those aircraft out to our operators to fly, for example, sunbird operations in North America or wherever. That's just one example. So matching capacity to demand is a big challenge. It's a big challenge in every market. I mean, it was a big challenge for me when I was working in Cyprus. It's certainly a similar challenge here. I think, you talk about many people who've tried this model, but I'm not sure that's quite true. I mean, it's a relatively small number of airlines that have tried, the low-cost model on the North Atlantic. And, those who have gone before, like Norwegian, like Primera, like WOW, have sort of left a mass of empirical data for us to sift through and analyze. So I'd say, we're learning from mistakes made in the past. But, in terms of a model that uses a new generation aircraft, that uses a base which provides us with a very strong cost advantage, and which has a sizable catchment in terms of both inbound and outbound traffic, I think that model probably hasn't been properly tested before. So we are first in that regard. Those changes may seem a little bit subtle to some people, but I think they're pretty much central to the question of sustainable profitability, and that's what we're chasing here. Because WOW Air was profitable; it did achieve profitability quite quickly. What it couldn't do was sustain that profitability, and without re-examining the wounds too deeply and reopening any of those wounds. I think one of the problems was that they invested in wide-bodied aircraft. They went into building a fleet of 6 A330s without really having a clear plan for how those aircraft were going to be used. That was one of the factors which led to their demise. But when they were operating a narrow-bodied fleet, and when they were building a network, they did achieve profitability, which is very encouraging.
Of course, and I think one of the biggest takeaways, I guess, from this piece so far that we've had and the chat we've had is really examining other airlines and weaknesses that we may have seen, but also you're in like you said, a different region completely. You have the larger catchment. So you're correct, I guess, in saying that it is just a little bit different while you're also taking key points from those other airlines. As we move into the last few questions, this is a community-driven one before we get on to looking towards the future. Someone was curious in learning a little bit more about plans for Belfast International. They wanted to understand if there were any future plans to, I guess, develop the facilities there, or did you believe as an airline that they're more than adequate and up-to-date, I guess, in comparison to maybe European counterparts?
I think the airport needs investment. I think we've spoken to the airport about what needs to be fixed, if you like, before we begin operations. I think the airport has been very responsive on that, and they have plans in hand to build stuff and to improve the infrastructure to the point where we can make this work from day one. The airport area itself, and I'm sitting in the airport hotel just a few yards off the perimeter fence. I mean, the airport estate is huge, and it does provide scope for developing, dare I say, a new terminal in time, a separate terminal for Fly Atlantic. It has space for developing a maintenance facility, a training center. We've been looking at a green technology center that might be developed here. So there's plenty of room to expand, and I think it has huge potential. There have been problems with the airport in the past at peak periods. But I think we're very encouraged by the commitment of airport management to invest in supporting the Fly Atlantic hub concept.
And it feels like the support from whether it be the government, whether it be the airport, whether it be the local councils has been so important and fundamental in getting Fly Atlantic to where you are now. Obviously, I'm sure it would have been far more difficult and maybe not as possible if you didn't have that support. So I'm sure for you as a chief executive, that's great to hear. We did mention that, look, 2024 is not far away. It's the unfortunate reality. It sounds far, but look, it's going to come at a moment's notice. So for you as a chief executive and planning out Fly Atlantic in the next, it's going to be a year and a half at the moment now. What does the plan look like? What are some of the most pressing tasks away from, we already discussed aircraft, and I guess finalising the route network, but more the areas maybe people are not too familiar with that needs to be secured?
Well, clearly it's, the big challenge is building a team and building a corporate culture. That our team will be drawn, 95% of them will be Northern Ireland recruits. So we're building a team of local people. But the challenge, of course, is instilling our values and building a corporate culture that's strong and resilient going forward. I think that in some ways that's the most interesting part of this job and the most fascinating part, but it's certainly challenging finding the right people at the right time for the right positions. And the second point, at the right time, is very critical here, because of course we're managing funds very carefully prior to generating revenues and selling tickets. And so you really got to fine tune this very, very carefully to ensure that you don't have 100 people sitting around an office with nothing much to do. And then the other extreme, that you're close to launch and you suddenly discover that some key functions are understaffed or undermanned. The challenge is to get this exactly right. I liken it. I'm a private pilot. I was a private pilot. I haven't flown for a while, but I liken it to landing a small plane on a windy day. You got to find that sweet spot on the runway and get it down at the right moment to avoid bumping along the runway. And it's measuring resources so that you hit that sweet spot, and you don't have too many people doing too little, but you don't have too few people with functions being stretched beyond the limit. It's a fascinating job, but that would be the biggest challenge. Just a word on the political support. I mean, the council in Northern Ireland, Antrim and Newton Abbey Council have been fantastic in giving great support to the project. There has been a bit of a political impasse in Northern Ireland. We don't want to go into immense detail on that. It's a complex issue, but I think that has unfortunately limited some of the political support we've got from the local government here. So we're hoping that impasse will be resolved in early 2023, and that we can get more enthusiastic backing from government here.
Mm-hmm. You said regarding the resources and I guess the resource management and not having too many people in one role and not having too little in the other. It is a fine line, and I think we have discussed it very briefly, but look, it can stretch to many other airlines, many other companies, even away from the industry, but actually having a thorough plan and a plan that works, taking the time, not rushing into things. Again, not to reopen wounds, but you mentioned WOW Air and the idea that they had those wide bodies and weren't totally sure what to do with them. Potentially with a plan, maybe those 330s wouldn't have arrived, or maybe we would have seen them deployed on specific services that may have worked. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And look, new airline launches are always incredibly intriguing to me. So that's why I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and dive into a little bit, and to end it on a fun note rather than taking a look at, say, the challenges or the market or the climate. Launching a new airline is a big thing. So being the chief executive, pardon me, and having that role, what would you say is the biggest advantage, or so far the most memorable moment, if you will, as being the chief executive of Flyatlantic?
Wow, that's a really tough question, Daniel. I mean, I would say that every startup I've been involved with has been very exciting, and of course the most exciting moment is the inaugural flight, when the dream becomes a reality. That's always the high point. Of course, we're not at that stage with Flyatlantic so far. I think in this process, unveiling the brand and going public on the airline has been the high point so far. But this is, as a famous statesman once said, the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. So we're still in very early days, and I think to be honest, a lot of the excitement is still to come. And what are those milestones? Of course, it's the inaugural flight. But before you have the inaugural flight, you have a proving flight with the regulator. That's always an exciting moment when you get the team together on a plane and you go off somewhere nice. We'll fly to somewhere suitably exotic, I'm sure. The opening of the offices, the first graduation for cabin crew, the first pilots to come through the door. All these are very, very memorable milestones in the development of an airline. They're all exciting. We had a lot of fun in all the startups I've been involved with up until now. I don't see Flyatlantic deviating from that pattern at all.
That's lovely to hear that the passion is there. And look, this goes right back to the beginning when we were discussing how you started in all those roles and having that burning passion for aviation, and look, going out and watching the planes. That was the same for me at a very young age. I also went out and watched the planes. So it's great to see the enthusiasm, the excitement, and look, to add on to that, even little things for Flyatlantic, whether it be a uniform arriving, the first plane, hearing news about it's all when you're I guess you could say, part of that experience and helping run it, like you said, there's always that sense of pride for every little thing that maybe someone else wouldn't think. That wraps up everything I had for today. I wanted to thank you very, very much for your time. Obviously, it's early in the UK, and it's now 2 a.m. here in the eastern part of Canada. I look very much forward to seeing the development of Flyatlantic in the future. Hopefully jump on board one of your flights as well when you guys get up in the air. And yeah, look forward to maybe catching up again maybe many months down the road to see how you guys are tracking.
That would be a pleasure, Daniel. Thanks very much.